Okay, we've come to the sixth pillar, the sixth conceptual pillar of the Risale-i. And this sixth pillar comes in the form of a very simple sentence. A very simple sentence which appears in Nursi's work on the self, which we looked at yesterday, the Ana. And it's a sentence which I think embodies an assertion which informs the whole of Sayyid Nursi's outlook, and in which we can find the subtext for Nursi's interpretation of the divine book of the cosmos. And it's a sentence which appears, an assertion which he makes in an almost throwaway manner. And it's quite easily overlooked. You can read the book on Ana and you can overlook this sentence. It's very easy to go past it without focusing on it. It's quite easily overlooked. Nursi says, the key to understanding the world is Ana, is I, the human I, is attached to the human I, the self. And as we saw yesterday, the human I, or the self, is the measure, is the yardstick by which all things are measured, including the names and attributes of God. And Nursi says, this is a key which we must learn to use. Because, and then he gives the famous sentence, while apparently open, the doors of the universe are in fact closed. This is a sentence which appears in the treatise on Ana, and it's very easy to miss it. And I must have read the treatise 3 or 4 times before this sentence suddenly jumped out. It seemed to me somehow this is important. And I tried over several years actually to understand why this is important. It's a very enigmatic sentence. It's a very strange sentence. What does it mean? While apparently open, the doors of the universe are in fact closed. Now, for Sayyid Nursi, this myth of the open doors of creation, this idea that the doors of creation are open, and we'll discuss in a second what we mean by this. This myth of the open doors of creation is one of the biggest obstacles to human happiness, because it appears to demystify the world by providing false answers to the fundamental questions that we pose of ourselves. So there is a myth, the myth of the open doors of creation. And again, we still haven't said what this myth is. Underpinning this myth is the idea that most of the questions that we ask of ourselves, such as, where am I from? Where am I now? What must I do? Where am I going? These questions, we are told, have been answered. In our society, in our secular liberal society, in our secular liberal materialist society, we have been told that these important questions have been answered. And therefore, the doors of creation are open. We know all there is to know about these things. And if there are things that we don't know at the moment, science will be able to tell us in the future. So there is an idea, there is a notion in modern secular society that the big questions have all been answered. There are no more big questions. They've been answered, and therefore the doors of creation are open. What does that mean, the doors of creation are open? Everything it's clear. It's clear what there is out there. There isn't a God. It's quite clear. We've covered that. We've answered that question. So there is this myth that the doors of creation are open. And Diagnosis says no. The doors of creation are not open. The doors of creation appear to be open, but they are in fact closed. And there are two currents of thought which are responsible for this myth of the open doors of creation. And these two currents of thought place human beings at the center of the universe. One of them is materialistic psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis. Now we have a psychoanalyst, we have a psychology student here, thankfully, who has been telling us a little bit about the discipline of psychoanalysis and psychology, and how it's anchored in materialism, and how it claims to have answered all our basic questions. So that is one of the currents of thought which contributes to this myth. It contributes to the myth of the open doors of creation. The other current of thought is something known as scientism. Not science, but scientism. And scientism is a current of thought which gives epistemological primacy to science. And I'll say a bit more about exactly what I mean by that later. We have two things, psychoanalysis and scientism. And they claim to have answered, or to be able to answer, most of the questions worth asking, including questions which belong to areas such as morality, art, ethics, and religion. These are areas which are outside the remit of science. But the ideology of scientism claims that science can also answer these questions. Scientism is the belief that science can answer everything, including questions which it has no right to be involved in. Now, we looked at cause and effect before, and at the very heart of scientism is the acceptance of cause and effect. Causes actually create their own effects. At the heart of scientism is belief in the laws of nature. And scientism is an ideological position which appears to shun all attempts to define the universe in anything but materialistic terms. In scientism, the primacy of nature and natural processes is taken as a given. And the sister was saying yesterday, our psychology student was saying yesterday, that in her discipline in psychology, secularism is taken for granted. And a secular mindset and a secular approach is taken as something which is guaranteed, which is taken as a given. Any attempts to bring God into the equation in any serious discussion with advocates of either psychology, psychoanalysis, or scientism is doomed from the outset. So our sister yesterday was saying that there can be no talk of God in modern psychology. There's no place, is there? Is there a place for God in modern psychology? There isn't. And scientism, which says that science can answer everything, there is also no place for God there. Now we're talking about a secular liberal society. Liberal. In other words, there is a freedom of inquiry. How can there be freedom of inquiry when the default setting is secularism and unbelief? Where is the freedom? Where is the liberality? So if you are in psychoanalysis, or if you are a scientist, and there are some scientists who are believers, but generally, if you are doing the natural sciences in the West, in the Western world, if you are doing psychoanalysis in the Western world, and these two are the most entrenched and the most serious currents of thought which are against the notion of God. If you're doing psychoanalysis or if you're doing science, there is no place for God in your discipline, in your subject. So this closes the door to further discussion. There is no discussion. Let's have a look at an example of scientistic thought. Not scientific thought, scientistic thought. This is actually written by, I think, a physicist or possibly a biologist, talking about how it's impossible to talk about God. It says the first thing we must do in order to discuss the matter at all, of course, is to contrast the hypothesis of a creator with others supposedly competing with it. In thinking about this, we at once encounter two problems. So he's saying, if you want to talk about God, there's a huge problem. First, the events we usually call instances of creation are themselves natural processes. And this makes it a little difficult to get the intended contrast off the ground. He's saying you can't talk about God because these things are natural. These things which believers talk about as examples of creation, these are natural processes. So the discussion, there is no discussion. You can't talk about God. Why would you want to talk about God? This is natural. So the discussion is killed right at the beginning. Mary baking pies is a creative process of a minor but nice sort. We don't think any magic is involved there. So they're equating belief in God with magic. The pie grows by purely natural processes. So what the scientistic advocates are saying is, we don't have a discussion about God because how can you? It's all natural. There is a world because there are natural processes. What does this mean, natural? What does it mean to say it's natural? How can it be created by God? It's natural. The word natural, as far as I know, in Arabic and in Persian and also in Turkish, is tabi'i. Tabi'i comes from the word tabi'a, and tabi'a, which is translated as nature, actually means how it is.
Natural disposition.
Tabi'a means how it is. So when they say it's natural, it means it is how it is. When someone says it's natural, what they're actually saying is it is as it is. Now, is that an explanation? Is that an explanation? If I say to a scientist, an unbelieving scientist, who created the tree? He says it is as it is. That's what natural means. Natural means tabi'i, it is as it is. This is what what Nursi is talking about. This is our problem, this is our obstacle. So, Implicit in this line of thinking is the notion that the material world is the only world we can comprehend. So the scientistic belief is that the material world is the only world that we can understand. And that we're just wasting our time thinking that anything mysterious or esoteric or otherworldly or transcendent, if you wish, is responsible for anything in the universe. We cannot even have a discussion. Now, for Said Nursi was not against science. He was a great respecter of science and scientific progress and technological advancement. So it's not scientific progress that is to blame. It's not scientific progress that makes us think that the doors of the universe are open. But it is the egoistic pride that comes with the scientistic approach to progress. Nursi says that we should see past these superficialities. And instead of stopping at the material, we should transcend it and acknowledge the ground or the source from which all of creation springs. And there is a quote from the Risale-i. And Said Nursi says, "Know, O friend, most of the knowledge of people about the earth and what they see as evident are based on a superficial familiarity, which is a veil spread on compound ignorance. They do not have any real foundations. For this reason, the Quran draws the attention of man to the usual and the ordinary. With its piercing expressions, it draws aside the veil of superficial familiarity, shows man how things seen as usual and ordinary under the veil of familiarity are in fact extraordinary." So Nursi says that we are habituated to seeing, for example, cause and effect. We are brought up in a causal system. We are very familiar with the causal system. We can't think outside the causal system. We can't think outside the box, as they say. Nursi says this is a very superficial way of understanding. For a scientist to turn around and say the tree exists because it exists, this is superficial understanding of reality. So for Said Nursi, this open doors myth is both a cause and a consequence of the apparent triumph of the self-referential approach to creation over the other indicative. You remember yesterday we talked about the two approaches to creation. The self-referential approach, ma'nai ismi approach, and the ma'nai harfi approach, other indicative. Nursi says it is the triumph, the victory of the self-referential approach over the other indicative approach, which has caused this myth. Because the self-referential approach limits investigation to the material world. And it claims that most of the fundamental questions worth asking have already been answered. Don't worry yourselves about the important questions. Science has answered them all. Science has solved our problems. Or if it hasn't solved our problems, it will solve our problems. And questions which are not about the material world are not worth asking. Why do you want to bother yourself about the existence of God? Who knows? Maybe there is a God, maybe there isn't. These are not the important questions. This is what we're being told. Because if anything transcends the material, how can you know it? If it's not material, how can you know it? It's unknowable. And if it's unknowable, it's not worth bothering with. So you can see why Nursi thought that the open doors myth was a dangerous one. This idea that all questions have been answered, that all problems have been solved, is a very dangerous one. That actually is as much as I have to say on Sayyid Nursi and the open doors of creation. I think it's a very, very dangerous thing for human beings to think that science or psychoanalysis, science has solved all of the problems out there, on the horizons, on the afaq, and psychoanalysis has solved all the problems in here, in the anfus.